Hello, how are you? I'm the professor, Dr. Chris McCusker, and welcome to another edition in the Quarantine Management Institute, where we are learning to lead in new ways together. It's good to be back. I was away for a couple weeks, taking care of an emergency situation, but everything is great, and I'm happy to be here. This episode concerns ethical wisdom. Ethical wisdom will become more and more important to us in the coming episodes as we think about the pandemic that we're still dealing with and how to not only recover but renew ourselves in the post-crisis environment. So I'd like to begin by giving you a little bit of an overview of this episode, a very important episode in the Quarantine Management Institute, an episode on ethical wisdom. I want to develop with you, based on the work of Henry Sidgwick, 3 basic methods of ethics, talk about each of them, compare and contrast them, and then introduce the concept of ethical wisdom, which is the standard that we want to think about and achieve as we recover and renew from this pandemic. Okay, let me get situated here. Great. Whenever we are using the word should, I should drink this coffee. My goodness. Or we should wear a mask. We should social distance. We should open society and get back to work. Whenever we're using the word should, we are making an assertion about ethics. Ethics concerns what ought to be or what should be when it comes to human conduct, how we treat each other. The reason we have ethics is because we're interdependent. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has underscored just how interdependent we all are all around the world. What happens in one part of the world affects things that happen in the other part of the world. What happens out there on the street affects me in my home. We are all connected. We are all interdependent. Interdependence means our outcomes, what we experience in terms of positive and negative consequences, depends on what other people do. It's the confluence of our own and others' actions. And because we are interdependent, we will use the word should. You should wear a mask. Why? Because you're going to get us all sick if you don't. You should socially isolate and quarantine, especially if you're sick, because you're going to get the rest of us sick if you don't. So we're using the word should quite a lot these days because we're dealing with a situation which really underscores just how interdependent we all are. Because we're interdependent, we use the word should. When we use the word should, we're making assertions about ethics. Now, I'd like to discuss 3 basic methods of ethics. Here I'm drawing on a very important philosophical work, the work by Henry Sidgwick called The Methods of Ethics, first published in 1874, a treatise on ethical theory, absolutely essential to anyone who wants to build moral theory and use ethical theory, which, by the way, I would say is all of us. Anytime we are using the word should, and we're making an assertion about what should or ought to be, we are building a moral theory of some kind. The concepts provided by Henry Sidgwick and his analysis stands apart in the classical tradition. I think the work of Henry Sidgwick is not yet fully appreciated, and over the coming decades, next 100 years or so, will become more and more and more important. I think Sidgwick attempts to do several things in his book, The Methods of Ethics, first published in 1874, 7th edition, published in 1907 by Hackett Publishing in Indianapolis, if you're interested in getting the book. You can also check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a great online resource and gives you a nice overview of Sidgwick's work. I've been reading the book off and on for 10 years. It is full of all sorts of interesting ideas. He basically reduces all of moral philosophy to 3 basic methods. And he compares and contrasts those methods, and he's really trying to figure out which is the best method, which is the best way for us to answer questions of how we should live, how we should conduct ourselves, how we should treat each other. The word should is used by any branch of the university If you go back to the medieval university, you had law, medicine, philosophy, and theology. All of those will address the word should. What I'm focused on here is the philosophical tradition. Philosophy is about using logic, common sense, and everyday experience to come up with answers to how we should behave, what ought to be, how we should treat each other. That's not to take away from the other branches of the medieval university, the other ways we could get to an answer about should. Theology is important. Medicine, law, they're all important. But philosophy stands apart because it doesn't make supernatural assumptions about governance of the world, God, or any other deity. It doesn't concern health outcomes per se or the legal environment. It concerns logic, common sense, and everyday experience. And how far can we go using that mode of thought to come to arrive at answers to the question of how we should live? Now, three basic methods that Henry Sidgwick identifies and compares and contrasts. The first is egoism. Egoism is about self-interest. Egoism is a method of ethics that relies on consequences. We are going to act according to our self-interest as we perceive it to be, defined by anticipated consequences. If I wear this mask, what are my personal results going to look like? Adam Smith, the moral philosopher, the Scottish moral philosopher, is famous for arguing that egoism is the basis for economic behavior, and if we act on egoism, we will achieve the best outcomes for society. A famous quote from Adam Smith: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but rather from their regard for their own interest." People are acting on self-interest. That's why we produce goods and services in a marketplace and we sell them. Another famous egoist is Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand, a U.S. philosopher who defined a philosophy called objectivism, which is essentially what Sidgwick would call egoism. Some differences, but basically. And I think to understand her philosophy, there's a nice quote here. She says, "To say I love you, one must first be able to say the I. I love you, I." So she was focused on the individual, and she was focused on egoism and objective consequences that would accrue to oneself. When we are acting on anticipated consequences that accrue to us as a person, that is egoism. Another method defined by Sidgwick is utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is also consequential. We want to calculate the consequences, but not to ourselves, but rather to a greater good. The famous phrase, the greatest good for the greatest number, is an egoistic expression. I want to act in a way that will produce the greatest positive consequences for the greatest number of people. That's egoism. We can simplify it by thinking of society. What's best for society? If I wear this mask, it is the best consequences for myself, but also the best consequences for society. Egoism is about me, consequences to me. Utilitarianism is about society, consequences to society. The third method that Sidgwick identifies is called moral intuitionism. Moral intuitionism is not a mathematical calculation. Moral intuitionism is an emotion. It's a feeling. We intuit from our emotion what the right thing to do is. It feels right or it feels wrong. It's an immediate emotional reaction to a course of action where we have a moral sense or a feeling about whether it's right or wrong. And we act on that emotion. I feel that this is the right thing to do. A lot of people these days are feeling that it's wrong. We're sick and tired of being sick and tired, and we want to get back to work, and we want to get things opened, and we no longer want to wear masks and social distance. We want to get back to normal. And that emotional reaction has led to demonstrations in the street about freedom and all sorts of other assertions about what's good. So we have basically three different ways to arrive at an answer to the question, what should I do? In other words, what should I do if I want to be good? One is egoism, act on my own self-interest. Another is utilitarianism, act on the interest or the consequences for society. And the third is not a mathematical calculation of consequences, but rather an emotion, an immediate emotion, what feels right, what feels good in terms of benevolence or concern for others. Henry Sidgwick compares and contrasts these three basic methods and desperately tries to figure out, using logic, common sense, and everyday experience, which method is better. What's the best method? How should we live? What should we be? Should we all be moral intuitionists? Should we all be utilitarians? Should we be egoists? And he tries very, very hard. So he argues that utilitarianism, acting on the consequences for society, and moral intuition are functionally equivalent. In other words, they will lead to the same behavior. That the real conflict in ethics is between egoism and the other two methods. And he tries desperately to figure out what's better, egoism or utilitarianism / moral intuitionism, and he cannot. He cannot. He desperately concludes at the end of his book that he cannot decide which method is better or superior to the others. And he argues that we must constantly have this conflict between our own self-interest and either utilitarian calculations or our moral intuition. It's a conflict that we have to have at different levels, internally, within our organization, within our family, within our society. We have to have this conflict over and over and over again. And the best solution to this conflict between methods of ethics is what he called ethical wisdom. Ethical wisdom is convergence between the methods. Ethical wisdom is finding a course of action which is wise, finding a course of action which is consistent with our own self-interest, consistent with the best consequences for society, and consistent with our principles. Can we create ethical wisdom? Can we figure out how to create wisdom when we think about the post-COVID environment, as we renew our society and our companies and our communities and our families and our organizations? Can we come up with wise solutions to problems that have been identified? Can we find solutions that are in our own self-interest, in society's interest, and also consistent with our principles? That is the creative challenge that we are facing today, and one that I hope to address further in the next couple episodes here in the Quarantine Management Institute, where we are learning to lead in new ways together. Ethical wisdom. This is what we have to focus on.